16, which verse 16 begins the next section, actually, of chapter 3. Goes through verse 26, which the end of the chapter, which is dealing this section, vengeance on the women. So he writes, and we'll read the entire section and then go back and look at it. Moreover, the Lord saith, because the daughters of Zion are haughty, and walk with stretched forth necks and wanton eyes, walking and mincing as they go, and making a tinkling with their feet. Therefore the Lord will smite with a scab the crown of the head of the daughters of Zion, and the Lord will discover their secret parts. In that day the Lord will take away the bravery of their tinkling ornaments about their feet, and their cauls, and their round tires like the moon, the chains and bracelets and mufflers, the bonnets and the ornaments of the legs, and the headbands, and the tablets and the earrings, the rings and the nose jewels, the changeable suits of apparel, and the mantles and the wimples and the crisping pins, the glasses and the fine linen, and the hoods and the veils. And it shall come to pass that instead of sweet smell there shall be a stink, and instead of a girdle a rent, and instead of well-set hair baldness, and instead of a stomacher a girdle of sackcloth, and burning instead of beauty. Thy men shall fall by the sword, and thy mighty in the war. And her gates shall lament and mourn, and she, being desolate, shall sit upon the ground. Okay. As you can see, this is a rather scathing rebuke on these women of Israel, or of Judah. In verse 16, he identifies, moreover, the Lord saith, because the daughters of Zion are haughty, and walk with stretched forth necks, and wanton eyes, and walking and mincing as they go, and making a tinkling with their feet. They are condemned for their worldliness. Many of these actions that he is describing here mark their pride that they have. They are having, he says, flirtatious eyes, wanton eyes. They are attention getting with their walking and mincing as they go, their anklets jangling as they walked. Everything that he is mentioning, and that he will mention in this section, was designed to bring the romantic attentions to themselves. And I could not help but think of today and our society. And when it says walking and mincing as they go, I couldn't help but think of these spiked heels that women wear. You almost wonder how in the world can they stand up on them. And you can tell that it's not comfortable by the way in which they walk. But what's the design of them? To bring attention to themselves and to make themselves, at least supposedly, make themselves more attractive. To shape the leg a little bit more. Well, you see a lot of parallels in what is seen then and what's seen now. But we've seen those parallels throughout the first 3 chapters, haven't we, in relationship to what Isaiah has written. And some people think that the Old Testament is old. It really applies as much to today as it did back then. Dale?
Amos was parallel, called them cows of Bashan, I think, and that made a few other remarks that were maybe talking about.
I believe that's in Amos, the 6th chapter, and yes, he calls them the cows of Bashan. But we do see a lot of, in fact, it seems as if so much of the dress today is designed for the very thing that Isaiah here is condemning. To bring a sexual appeal to the body. Of course, Peter says that it's to be the hidden man of the heart and not the outward clothing that we should be concerned with. Yet, very few in our world are concerned with the inward man, and they are concerned with the outward man. The multi-billion-dollar cosmetic industry shows the nature of that. Who was it that referred to makeup as their war paint? An old-time preacher, I've forgotten which one said it, but they were going out to war, in other words, to attract men. The way that men should be attracted by women is through their righteous living, their good demeanor, and not by an appeal to the physical. It might have been Joe. I was thinking about him when I said that, but I don't know if it was him. It might have been someone else. But it's something that I remember hearing when I was a small child, maybe about 20 years ago. Yeah, he was rather stoic as far as his presentation in the pulpit. That's 1 Peter 3, verses 1 through 6, that if that is the case, a Christian woman being married to a non-Christian, that they might by your chaste conversation, Paul says. Not chaste, but chaste conversation, or manner of life, they can be one without a word being spoken to them, by the good, godly influence of a Christian woman. Dale?
My daughter's husband was a Baptist, thought he was fine, and my daughter had major impact on him, caused him to be receptive, and he made the gospel. He called me when I was coming south from 65 and asked me to come by. After an hour and 45-minute discussion, I gave him about 18 Leroy Brownlow tracks that I had in the front. He read a bunch of them, and 2 weeks later, he obeyed the gospel.
Yeah.
My daughter was the main cause.
There are numerous stories of a godly woman converting someone who's not a Christian, just like your daughter, and converting a Baptist to someone who's not a Christian, and thus saving a soul because of their godly life. And some women because they don't put God first in their life, will never win their husbands, because they allow the world to play too big of a part in their life. But this is, yes.
So is that what God told the nation of Israel to not co-mingle with these other nations?
There's two reasons for that. Number one was to keep the bloodline pure. Christ was going to be born of the seed of Abraham and then of David. That bloodline had to be kept pure, so that fulfillment of that promise could take place. The second reason is because that God knows that through the intermingling with the nations, they would influence Israel to do that which was wrong and sinful. And that is what took place. And thus he told them, in going into the land of Jerusalem, or into the land of Canaan, to destroy all of the nations. Another reason for that aspect was he was bringing a righteous judgment upon the wicked, even as he did later on Jerusalem, as he did Assyria, Babylon, and all of these other nations. A righteous judgment because of the sins of those nations, and thus you go in and you destroy them utterly or totally.
So Solomon was supposed to be, per se, one of the wisest, if not wisest, men in the world, and he had foreign wives, and they caused him to worship foreign gods. Is that correct?
He, because of his wives, did go astray, yes, and worshipped false gods. So that would be the case. Verse 17 then, God tells him, therefore the Lord will smite with a scab the crown of the head of the daughters of Zion, and the Lord will discover their secret parts. In verse 16, they are seeking attention. Verse 17, they're going to get attention, but not the type of attention that they want or that they desired. They were seeking an attraction for men in that regard, but instead, God here, the attention that they're going to get is that God is going to smite them with scabs and baldness. Yeah, you can say they're going to have a bad hair day. Fact is, they're not going to have hair to have a bad hair day. So in one sense, they're not going to have a bad hair day. They're not here to have a bad hair day. But that's the attention that God's going to give them because of the way in which they were. Homer Haley stated, to their shame and humiliation, the sexual features to which they would attract attention will be laid bare in the hands of crude, rough, barbarous captors. That's what he's expressing, that here's these sexual aspects, everything that they would use to attract men, and those things are just going to be laid bare. They're going to be taken away, and there's nothing left as far as any attractiveness at all. Now, they didn't develop the inner person, and as a result of not developing the inner person, they have no beauty at all. All they were concerned about was the physical beauty, and that's taken away. You can say, they are ugly as dogs now. And dogs are probably a lot prettier than they were. But that's the type of situation that you have because they don't have any inward beauty. They just dealt with the outward. Dale, you want to say something?
So there's a bunch of places in Isaiah that said focused on the remnant surviving, but didn't Jeremiah say that Jeremiah, the Lord would let some of them, broadcast their suffering, and they weren't necessarily the remnant, so they could draw attention to themselves. And I can't remember the wording of the quote. Jeremiah mentioned that not some of the people that weren't the remnant would be moaned and be allowed to survive, to draw attention to their disobedience. Isn't that true?
There is a there is a remnant that was going to be spared. Some individuals, though, were not faithful even in that remnant, and they were taken away into captivity. That's what Isaiah is describing here. There's these women. They are going to be, as Haley put it, they're going to be laid bare in the hands of crude, rough, barbarous captors.
So he's anticipating what Jeremiah later to say, I guess.
Yeah.
Is what he's doing. Okay.
You got the same type of a principle that Isaiah is here presenting. Here's these women who try to attract attention of the man, and by their outward appearance, they're going to be taken captive, and all of that beauty that they had will be taken away. In verses 18 through 23 then, he says, in that day, the Lord will take away the bravery of their tinkling ornaments about their feet, and their cauls, and their round tires like the moon, the chains and the bracelets and the mufflers, the bonnets and the ornaments of the legs, and the headbands and the tablets and the earrings, the rings and nose jewels, the changeable suits of apparel, and the mantles and the wimplets, and the crisping pins, the glasses and the fine linen, and the hoods and the veils. Isaiah describes the ornaments that these wealthy women of that day would use and would have. Over 20 items here are listed. And he's saying all of them are going to be taken away during the captivity as spoils of war. These women will not have them anymore. Dub McClish wrote about these verses, due to the profound effect women have in society, one can always get a picture of the spiritual health of a nation by observing the spiritual health of its women. Here are women who lived in the very shadow of the temple of God and should have been demonstrating to all the world what it meant to reverence and serve God in all modesty and purity. Instead of evincing the beauty of holiness, they had adopted the sensual and carnal habits of the nations about them. It is not the adornment nor the adorning that were intrinsically wrong, but that they were vain and evil beneath it all, and their superficial beautification could not hide the putrefaction that lay beneath the surface. And he basically has it right on that. They were ugly inside. Even though they should have been, as the children of God, setting forth the beauty of holiness and righteousness, they were instead had ignored that aspect just to get the sensual aspects of men aroused. But one of the things that he makes the point that one can always get a picture of the spiritual health of a nation by observing the spiritual health of the women. It has ever been the case, and I don't care what society you live in or what time you live in, that women are the ones who uphold morality. When the women start evincing immorality and lowering that standard of morality, then the nation goes into total chaos and falls.
Women could stop to pornography just that quick if they would quit posing for all them pictures that would kill it.
It would.
When all
The-
the customers saw it, and then they saw the one that the paper delivery saw, she went to head, you know what I mean?
Oh, I see what you're talking about. Now, before they put all their war paint on and fixed their hair and everything else, and it made themselves attractive. If it,
Bad news. Can't tell the boys from girls. Can't tell the men from the women.
well, that has become another problem in our society. Men becoming women and women becoming men. In reality, they don't, even though they attempt to and even will have surgery. But women have always upheld the standard of morality. Now, you look at our society today, the women are just as bad nowadays in our society as the men ever were. And maybe they're worse in many respects.
Today, in our society, they made it easy on the boys. The boys wait for them to call them, and they come pick them up. They take them out, pay for everything. They don't have to do anything.
Yeah, you're right. And oh my, that's unheard of nowadays. It's they would find a way if they really wanted to. But our society today, just in the women do not uphold any standards of morality. If you look at the clothing that they wear, and have you ever, in reading the Bible, noticed that God always deals with the women's clothing? How often does he deal with the men's clothing? Is there a reason for that?
Women's clothing is what entices us.
Their apparel wasn't too enticing yet. What they wore.
The reason for it, there's several reasons, but one is that men are enticed by sight. Generally speaking, women are not. Women are enticed by other things that men generally don't care about too much.
Young girls today are just beautiful. If you look at them on the surface, they are gorgeous. But when they open their mouth, they take all that away.
The language of our society is, and that's including the women, that they can. The women today have, used to talk about the men talking like a sailor. Well, now then women talk just as bad. put them to shame sometimes, and that's true. But clothing, why? Because the sight appeals to man. And women, by the proper clothing, upholds the standards of morality. When you start showing off the physical body, then the attraction is to the physical and not to the mental, to the moral aspect. And I heard the figure, I think it was by Toynbee, the historian that had studied the histories of man. And he said, this is back years ago, that when a nation reaches the moral degradation of what United States was, and this again, a few decades ago, that 19 out of 21 of those nations had been destroyed. They do not survive. Our nation needs to take heed, but it won't. Something's going to give at some point in time where our nation falls. But here, all of these things that the women use as adornments, they're taken away, and only the ugliness remains. In verse 24 then, and it shall come to pass that instead of sweet smell, there shall be stink. Instead of a girdle, a rent, and instead of well-set hair, baldness, and instead of a stomacher, a girding of sackcloth and burning instead of beauty. Any of you women, when you start getting dressed, put on perfume, sweet smell? Some men probably do as well, except we call it cologne. We don't put on perfume. Well, he's here, the sweet smell replaced by stink. They stink now instead of smelling nice. A rope of slaves is going to replace the beautiful sashes that they would wear. And goes back to the beautiful hairdos that they had. They're all going to be bald now. Rough sackcloth is going to replace their soft garments. Probably most, if not all of you, have felt sackcloth. How would you like wearing it all the time? That's what they're going to have. And they're going to be branded as slaves or prisoners, which will also deface their beauty. So basically, Isaiah just taking the entirety of women and everything that would be appealing as far as a woman is concerned. He's saying it's gone, it's taken away, it's going to be replaced by ugliness, by a stench, by rough clothing. Whatever it is, it's gone, or going to be replaced with something that's bad. So that's the situation with the women. I can just imagine some of the women in our society, if those things happened to them, and the reactions that would be seen as a result. Well, verse 25, he says, "Thy men shall fall by the sword, and thy mighty in the war." So here you've got a nation that's coming down and the men go out to battle and they fall in battle. Even the mightiest, the strongest of warriors, the mighty in war. So the strongest men, they fall in battle. Their strength cannot help them. And verse 26 then, her gates shall lament and mourn, and she being desolate shall sit upon the ground. The devastation that is coming upon them is so great that the gates that are normally filled with laughter and commerce and all of those things that would be going along with that, it's now filled with sorrow. The city of Jerusalem, he's describing, is going to be an utter desolation, destruction, ruin. There's nothing but sorrow left. And if you want to see the fulfillment of that, read Lamentations. Because Lamentations, well, the shortened form of that is lament. It's a lament over the city of Jerusalem. Jeremiah saw the destruction, lived on after the destruction of Jerusalem, and he then writes Lamentations as a lament or a sorrow over the city.
You can also read Nehemiah 2 and 3. Get a few peeks at it.
Lamentations, the entire book deals with it. That's the entirety of the book. A lament over Jerusalem. Chapter 4. Verse 1, there's a lack of men. In that day 7 women shall take hold of one man, saying, we will eat our own bread and wear our own apparel. Only let us be called by thy name to take away our reproach. It was considered a reproach to be an unmarried woman in Jerusalem. Someone turn over to Isaiah or Genesis, the 30th chapter, and read verse 23. Genesis chapter 30 and verse 23. Okay, there specifically in relationship to bearing a son, bearing a child. If you didn't bear children, it was a reproach. You see the same thing in 1 Samuel 1 and verse 6. That her adversary also provoked her sore to make her fret, because the Lord had shut up her womb. So, an unmarried woman, a childless woman, there could be almost no greater reproach to a woman than that type of situation. Again, quite a change from our society, isn't it? Where women almost glory in not being married and not having children. There, at that time, it was a reproach, a shame for a woman not to have children. But at this time, there were so few men in Jerusalem that 7 women would approach one man to be their husband for the express purpose of removing the reproach or the shame that was associated with not being married.
That could be brought about by war.
that is oftentimes brought about by war. The men go out to fight, they die, and as a result, you don't have the men available any longer.
We experienced in Russia because they had lost so many men in those wars over there that the women outnumbered them 3 to 1. They wouldn't do this.
They weren't doing this, but that's what caused the shortage, and that's what's causing the shortage here in Isaiah's day. The battles that they went out, and again, you go back to the previous chapter and verse 25, that the men shall fall by the sword, thy mighty in the war. So there's the men dying in battle. So now then, you have, if you want to use the exact figure, a 7-to-1 ratio. And I don't think he's using that as an exact ratio. I think he's using just a number that shows the greatness of this disparity of the two, men and women. But 7 women here approaching one man. Marry me so that I can have your name, and it won't be a shame to me anymore. And to further this, they offer, well, we'll support ourselves. You don't have to support us. You don't have to do anything, except we want your name. We'll provide food. We'll provide clothing. Just let me be called by his name. Again, Dub McClish wrote, if the awful consequences of sin cannot be seen from the grievous description Isaiah gives us of Judah and Jerusalem, it can never be seen. You have in chapter 3 and this first verse of chapter 4 a great description of what sin does. It destroys, it devastates everything and everyone. That's what sin does. And yet we today in our nation glorify sin and wickedness so that it grows worse and worse. They've made it legal. They've done everything they can in order to promote wickedness. And yet, if we went back and just read this and what happens, all realizing it's because of these sins and these wickedness. We've gone way beyond even the wickedness of these nations, and God destroyed them. How much longer will it be before he destroys the United States? But you could also say that in relationship to a whole bunch of other nations as well, couldn't you? It's not just the United States. To a great extent, it is a worldwide problem.
What happened in Germany and Italy and France and all those nations after they did what they did?
Because of their sins, well, I'll say it and get in trouble. If you agree with it, that's fine. If you disagree with it, that's fine. Could God have been using those nations to punish other nations? Could he have been using Germany and the Nazis to be punishing all the European nations that they fought against? Well, could be. There's no way to prove one way or the other. But you do see finally the destruction of Nazis and also Italy and Japan and those nations that had joined with them, you finally see the destruction of them. And when we go back, you see the wickedness that they were engaged in. The sin. Hitler, he had accepted Darwinian evolution, the survival of the fittest. What was one of the reasons that he sought to exterminate the Jews? That was a part of it, but that's not the main part. That's what he used to incite the people. But they were out seeking for what? The master race. That's evolutionary thought. We're going to be a master race. We're going to evolve into a greater people. And these others are inferior. And so we exterminate those that are inferior so that we can have a pure master race. That's evolution. And so they had kicked God out, eliminated God, brought in this atheistic evolution, and that's what the result you have. So,
One time, it's entitled "The Science of Eugenics, Hereditary Breeding." That was after World War II.
okay. Next week, then, we will start with chapter 4 and verse 2.